Hey, sophomores, we're going to get into our first word for chapter 25, and it is Armenian Genocide. Armenian Genocide was the mass and purposeful killing of Armenian people in what was then the Ottoman Empire and what is today Turkey. It is very well known because it is also the first real mass execution of an ethnic group in the 1900s or 20th century. And it will lay a path for future genocides and massacres which will continue to happen. And this happened during World War I, when the majority Turk population, which is going through Turkification in Turkey, and they saw that the Armenians were not loyal enough in Turkey, and they suspected them of cooperating with Russia and other enemies of Turkey. Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was in line to become the emperor of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. However, he was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, and this ends up causing World War I to happen because there are different alliances that form. Basically, Austria-Hungary really cracks down on Serbia, but Russia sees Serbia as an ally, so they back Serbia. And then we have all these alliances forming, which leads to World War I happening. Woodrow Wilson was the president both before, during, and after World War I. He's also very well known in this chapter because at the Treaty of Versailles, he basically works at the end of World War I to try to bring the people together. He works against colonization. He works for more freedoms with his 14 points, and even works to start the League of Nations. Many of these goals that he had weren't accomplished. British and France end up taking back colonies during this time, and the United States doesn't even become a member of the League of Nations because Congress doesn't approve it. However, he is known at this time for fighting for democracy and freedom for many people around the world after the end of World War I. Ho Chi Minh was a leader in Vietnam, and he was a person who was seeking for freedom for the Vietnamese people because they were a colony of France. Now, he will live a long time, but he will be at Versailles at the end of World War I when the peace conference is going on, and he will advocate for Vietnam to become free. This doesn't get listened to. Vietnam continues to be part as a French colony, and eventually this will lead to Vietnam resisting not only the French, but also he will later become communist because he sees it as a way for Vietnam to become free, and this will also lead to the U.S. and Vietnam fighting the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 70s. The Black Hand was a separatist group, so this was a group of people who lived in Serbia who wanted the land of Serbia to become a free country and wanted to separate from the Austria-Hungarian Empire. A member of the Black Hand, Gavrilo Princip, will assassinate and murder Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which will help lead to World War I beginning. The Triple Entente was Britain, France, Russia, basically agreeing to form a Franco-Russian alliance, which was to counterbalance Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy at this time. These will be allies that will fight together during World War I when war eventually does break out. The Triple Alliance was the alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy started in 1882, and this will become a bloc that will eventually ally themselves together, but then again they will fight against the Triple Entente in World War I, which leads to a very large military war, which becomes World War I. The Soviet Union was a massive country that existed and basically came towards the end of World War I it began. There was a communist revolution following the principles of Karl Marx that was led by Vladimir Lenin, which led to Russia becoming communist. But then they gained more land and territory. Today it's 15 countries, and it was a huge communist country that at the end of World War I becomes more powerful, especially at the end of World War II, and ends up developing a rivalry with the United States, which will become known as the Cold War after World War II. Also in this era, when the country of Russia will fall in this era and will be replaced by the Soviet Union at the end of World War I, and the Soviet Union will withdraw and will leave the war. The League of Nations was an alliance of nations that formed after World War I with the idea of working together to stop another war. Unfortunately, the United States will not join the League of Nations. Other nations like Japan will end up leaving the League of Nations, and it won't be very effective, and World War II will happen 20 years after World War I. The League of Nations, however, the ideals of it will be established with the United Nations, which is a global alliance of nations, which does exist until this day. Pan-Arabism is an ideal that was started to unite people who had a common culture. Many people who were Muslims, who were Arabic speakers, to unite together and work together for the betterment of themselves. This will also start as an anti-colonial movement, as many of these nations were colonies, especially before World War I and even some afterwards. Zionism is the idea that came from Jewish people who wanted to form their own country or their own state, because the belief was, and much of history has shown this, that there was much anti-Semitism in Europe and other places like Russia where Jewish people had settled. So Jewish people felt within reason that they needed to form their own nation, and this would be the nation of Israel, which will get formed after World War II, after the Holocaust. But Zionism does begin both before and during World War I. The May 4th movement was originally a fight for China to become more democratic. It will also be seen as a way for China to become independent and to reform its own government after it had been abused and, as we talked about in the last era, basically cut up by European powers and Japan. Today it's also seen as for nationalism, especially for the Communist Party, that it was a way to bring China together as a more powerful nation. Militarism was a major cause of World War I happening. During the time right before World War I, nations like Germany, Britain, France, Russia were making their militaries stronger. Their militaries were becoming more powerful. And there was a belief that in these nations, because there was so much nationalism as well, that they could defeat any other nation. And many nations believed this, so they were not afraid to go to war. In militarism as well, many people actually look forward to war, as they thought it may be a natural state for the strongest to survive, that they could take over their neighbors. So militarism definitely leads to, as militaries get bigger and stronger, to the beginning of World War I. Secret alliances. Secret alliances were a major cause of World War I as well. We talked about the two secret alliances that occurred between Italy, Austria-Hungary, Germany, the Triple Alliance, which also included the Ottoman Empire, should be a fourth member, and also the Triple Entente of Russia, France, and Britain. Basically, these alliances said if one of them was attacked, all of them were attacked. So once we had the Archduke Franz Ferdinand get killed in the Austria-Hungarian Empire by Serbian nationalists, suddenly we had all of these nations fighting each other in a huge world war. The Lusitania was a ship that was sunk by German U-boats, and it was going from the United States to Britain. There were Americans on board, and the U-boats from Germany suspected that it was moving arms that were going from the United States to Britain. So Germany thought that the United States was helping supply Britain with weapons, which they were, and they shot down this ship, which also killed Americans. Now, this will be one cause of bringing the United States into World War I, as this turns many Americans against the Germans because of the loss of life. The Zimmermann Telegraph was a telegraph that the British intercepted and gave to the Americans. It was a telegraph that was Germany trying to communicate with Mexico, telling them that if Mexico would go to war with the United States, that Germany would help them, and that they would help Mexico get the land back that the United States took during the Mexican-American War. Now remember, Germany was pretty busy fighting in Europe at this time, so Mexico didn't take this deal because they realized that, well, Germany's not really going to be there to help us. And the last time Mexico fought the United States, they lost a bunch of land. But the British intercepted this and gave this to the Americans, and this enraged the American people and was really a huge, if not the biggest cause leading the United States to enter World War I. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, this was the treaty that had Russia leave World War I as it became the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union became the new government in Russia, and they agreed to leave World War I because of the huge losses of people that Russia was going through. It was a treaty that also took a lot of land away from the Soviet Union as well, as we can see this chunk here that was given to Germany at this time. So Germany definitely does take advantage of the Soviet Union leaving the war, and that'll actually come back to bite Germany because France and Britain will do the same thing to Germany when they leave in the Treaty of Versailles. Total war occurs during World War I. Total war is basically that nobody is left out of the war, that civilians could be fair game to be involved in the war and could lose their lives, that everyone is working towards the war effort. This basically means like even though the war might not be near your home, you're probably still involved. You are still working towards the war effort. Whether it is, you potentially being attacked, or even you working every day for the war effort. So total war is basically everyone, the total community, everyone is involved in the war. Propaganda. Propaganda posters were used in World War I all the time. These were posters that gave a very one-sided view. They were very nationalist. This one says, "Beat back the Huns with the Liberty Bonds." It's from the United States. It's basically showing the Germans as barely even being human on there, like they're monsters. It totally picks the other side as being evil, your side being good, and is trying to get people to join the war effort in any way possible. And propaganda was heavily used by all sides during World War I. Gallipoli was a major battle that took place against the Ottoman Turkish Empire. And there were many people from both New Zealand and Australia who were fighting for the British Empire. So Gallipoli, there was a lot of bloodshed. A lot of people died in this fighting to take land away from the Ottoman Turkish Empire. The Battle of Gallipoli was a disaster for the Allies as they were not able to win the battle, and the Ottoman Empire was able to get a win. However, the Ottoman Empire will eventually fall in World War I. Armistice basically means both sides agree to stop fighting. Both sides agree to stop fighting. Originally, there was called Armistice Day, which was the day that World War I ended. The Treaty of Versailles, which took place just outside of Paris at Versailles, and this was an important treaty that brought an end to World War I. And the treaty ended the war, but most of the blame for the war went to Germany. Germany had to give up a lot of their land, all of their colonies, and had to pay war reparations back to the Allies. And really, this isn't like World War II so much, where there's more clear cut who's right and who's wrong. All sides definitely had blood on their hands and had some blame in World War I. However, because Germany lost, they ended up having to pay and suffer most of the consequences from the war, where France and England were able to regain their colonies at this time and did not suffer anywhere near as much in the post-war as Germany did. The Balfour Declaration, as you can see here, was a public statement by the British government in 1917 during World War I announcing that they were supporting a national home for the Jewish people in the land called Palestine. So that would be a place for the Jewish state, which would become Israel eventually. There was a problem with this, and let's get to that word Palestine. Palestine is also Palestinians were already living in this area. So Palestinians were living in the area today, what is called Israel. And what happens is the British actually promised this land to both groups, which is absolutely a horrible thing to do. And this will lead to a lot of fighting and violence that continues until this day. What actually happens is Israel slowly gets more and more of the land up until the present borders today, and the Palestinians are put on smaller pieces of land. The biggest problem with the Balfour Declaration is this land was promised to two different groups of people who both have historic ties to this land. Israel is the land which the Jewish people say is their ancient homeland from the Old Testament. But remember, the Palestinians were also living there for over 1,000 years after the Jewish were kicked out by the Romans. So we have a controversy here that both groups have very, very good claims to this land and is sacred to both of them. And unfortunately, it's caused a lot of violence until this day.